Good morning and welcome to today's training session on the new pathway for recognising products certified overseas, and also the introduction of recognition notices as a deemed to comply compliance pathway. Alongside this, we'll also take a few moments to clarify the main differences with Codemark, multi-proof and independent appraisals. Now, today's session is specifically for BCA'S and follows our introductory webinar on this pathway back on the 10th of September. So just to recap, this is all part of the government's goal to reduce the cost of construction, and at the heart of this legislation is increasing competition and reducing barriers. In particular, the requirement and cost for local certification of quality tested overseas building materials. So if a product has been through a robust and regarded certification scheme overseas, why should that product require local certification to be trusted for use here? Many of you attended our session on the 10th of September. For those of you who missed it, my name is Matthew Duda. I'm General Manager of EBOS. EBOS has spent the last 19 years working with product suppliers to format their technical documentation, and we also manage the BPIR ready software. Today, I'm coordinating this training with a team of MB principal advisors and management who will be introduced shortly. We're also joined in the background by Claire, Evan, Byron, Ellen, and Radna from MB, who will be assisting with your questions and comments. Now, in terms of expectations, our training today should take around 35 to 40 minutes. We've also allowed another 40 minutes for your questions at the end. We're going to cover a bit of detail today, so if you do miss anything, there will be a recording of the training published on the Building Performance website over the next week or so. And during the session, we certainly appreciate your feedback. And to begin with, we will be running polls shortly and at the end of today's session. To start, we'd like to check in to see whether you've had any initial involvement with this new legislation, particularly the recognition notices that are a key output of this pathway. We'll also be using the Q&A function, and as I mentioned, we have a team there who look to address those either during the session online or as part of the question session that follows. So back to what we've got for today's session. Firstly, we'll provide a short recap on how this new approved product certified overseas pathway works. We'll run through what a BCA is required to do if an application for a building consent includes a recognition notice. Provide an overview of the Codemark scheme, including BCA responsibilities, and a deep dive into Section 19 of the Building Act for Codemark. We'll then touch on information around the other product assurance pathways, highlighting some of the other schemes and their similarities and differences. And then we'll move on to BCA's responsibilities for the multi-proof scheme. Now, to kick things off, I'd like to welcome Amanda McCauley, Principal Advisor in MB's System Performance and Implementation team. She'll provide an introduction to the approved products legislation. And Amanda, very good morning.
Thanks, Matt, and kia ora koutou, everyone. So for those who've attended previous webinars on this topic, you'll know that this pathway for recognised products is one of 3 that have been introduced to provide New Zealanders with more choice of building products and healthier, safer and more durable buildings while balancing costs. So just a wee recap on approved products. So at a high level, this pathway will see MB evaluating building products or building methods certified under an overseas product certification scheme and issuing recognition notices for those products. Now, these recognition notices will have the same status as a product certificate under the Building Act and must be accepted by building consent authorities if the product is being used within the limitations and conditions of recognition. Recognition notices will detail what New Zealand Building Code clauses and standards the products have been assessed against, and if there are any limitations or conditions on the product's use. So, as you may have heard in previous webinars, the process for recognising overseas product certificates involves 2 key steps. One is the assessment of the product certification scheme itself against the criteria that are set out in the regulations, and then an evaluation of the product certificate itself. So today we thought it'd be good to take a closer look at certification schemes, as we've noticed there's some confusion around there, out there about what they are and how they work. So what is a product certification scheme? Now, the key elements of a certification scheme are: first, there needs to be an accreditation body, and these accreditation bodies are usually part of an international organisation like the International Accreditation Forum. Now, these accreditation bodies accredit conformity assessment bodies, or CABs for short, to ensure they meet appropriate standards. Now, CABs are also independent organisations that assess whether a product complies with relevant standards. They typically review test results rather than conduct testing themselves, although they may request additional testing if that's required as part of certification. Now, this can be kind of confusing when organisations like brands operate multiple functions under one brand. So certification schemes do require clear separation of roles to manage conflicts of interest and maintain impartiality. Now, certification schemes often align with standards such as ISO 17065, which ensures CABs have robust systems and procedures in place and that these are properly implemented. Now, another important thing to consider is that certification isn't a one-off step. Certified products are regularly monitored to ensure continued compliance through audits, checks on installation methods, and updates to technical documentation. So a good question you might be thinking to yourself is, if a product's already certified overseas, why do we need to recognise it locally? So under this new legislation, MB can evaluate overseas schemes and certificates and then issue a recognition notice confirming that the product meets New Zealand Building Code performance requirements. We've started with the Australian watermark scheme to test this process, with plans to expand to other product categories over time. So how does this recognition process on MB's behalf, how does this work in practice? So there are product certification schemes operating all around the world. Now, these schemes evaluate and certify products based on their own rules and standards. Once a product meets those requirements, a product certificate is issued by CAB and ongoing monitoring begins. When someone applies for product evaluation through the new Overseas Building Products pathway, MB will check several key criteria. 1, is the certification scheme accredited to an appropriate standard by a recognised accreditation body? 2, does the scheme have robust processes in place? And importantly, do those processes cover how schemes evaluate, certify, and monitor products or methods? We also look to see whether the scheme ensures its staff and certifiers act independently, professionally, and with integrity. These checks are essential to ensure that the overseas certification scheme is trustworthy and that the product certificate can be relied on to meet New Zealand Building Code requirements. So let's talk about the output of this process, what we call a recognition notice. So to issue a recognition notice, MB must, 1, evaluate the certification scheme to ensure it meets the criteria set in the regulations, as I've just mentioned, and 2, assess the product certificate issued under that scheme. Now, once we've confirmed that the scheme does meet those requirements, we then assess the certificate by checking whether it's publicly accessible, if there is sufficient technical detail to interpret the product's intended use, and the product's compliance with the relevant clauses of the New Zealand Building Code. We'll also look at any conditions, limitations, bans, or warnings on that product, either in New Zealand or in overseas jurisdictions, and looking at the accreditation of the certifier to ensure that accreditation is valid. Most importantly, we need really solid evidence that the product will comply with the building code when used as intended. And MB will usually engage external experts to support this technical evaluation. If the certificate meets all these criteria, we'll start beginning to draft a recognition notice. So what is a recognition notice? Now, it's a form of secondary legislation similar to acceptable solutions or verification methods. When we reference certificate numbers or standards in a recognition notice, it's considered incorporation of material by reference, which requires public consultation. Now, we held public consultation in early September for phase 1 products. Now, once we've gone through public consultation, we'll review submissions, and then we may either finalise the notice as we proposed in the consultation, we may amend notices based on feedback, or we might decide not to proceed. Now, if we do proceed, the Minister for Building and Construction will table the recognition notice in Parliament. Once tabled, it's officially confirmed and published in the New Zealand Gazette and on our Building Performance website. Now, recognition notices can be amended or revoked if the product certificate changes or becomes invalid, or there are any other changes that may impact its ability to meet those identified building code clauses. I'll now pass on to Sophie Cunningham, Manager of Building Regulatory Services, who will now run us through how this looks in practice. Thanks, Sophie.
Thanks, Amanda, and kia ora koutou. So MB's Building Performance team have recently published a step-by-step guide that walks through the building consent process for this new pathway. It's available for viewing on our website, and the link to this will be posted in the chat for this session at some time. We will use this as a starting point to cover how a recognition notice will be used for a building consent. So the first step is pretty familiar and similar to how things are done now. A homeowner will engage a designer to design a new house and to act as an agent for obtaining a building consent. The second step will be that the designer completes the design of the house, ensuring that the plans and specifications comply with all relevant performance requirements of the building code. Through this development, the designer has specified using an overseas certified product that is on the approved product certified overseas list of recognised building products or methods. The designer includes the recognition notice for that product as well as the product certificate as supporting information for the building consent. The designer or person acting on behalf of the homeowner then submits the application for a building consent. The council must then check that the application is complete enough to be accepted for processing, and then processing and the statutory clock begins. So step 6 in our step-by-step guide is where most of the meat of this training for approved products certified overseas will sit. And to make this process as consistent as possible, we've drafted up a bit of a checklist that a building consent authority can follow if they're processing a consent that is accompanied by a recognition notice. So we'll use that to guide you through what a BCO should be doing. Step 1 is to make sure that the recognition notice that has been supplied with the building consent is current and listed on our register. If yes, then you can move on to the next step. And if no, then this product is not considered deemed to comply with the building code, and a BCA will need to conduct a normal reasonable grounds assessment. So where can you find recognition notices to complete step 1? We've got a bit of a recording here of where to find that, and I will run you through that now. So our recognition notices can be found on our Building Performance website under the Building Code Compliance and Certification Schemes tab. You navigate through to the Approved Products Overseas pages and click on Recognition Notices. You should then move to Current Notices, and it should take you there. There is a slightly shorter way to do this. So if you go back to our homepage on the Building Performance website, you can use our search function in the top right-hand corner, type in recognition notices and hit enter. And when the search results appear, just select the appropriate search result and it will take you to the same page we were on just before. We do recommend making the current recognition notices page a favorite in your web browser so you can easily find them when you need them. Our current notices are created by standard, so you can find them that way as well if you need to. Next up is making sure that the particular watermark certificate that has been provided is actually listed on one of the notices. And you guessed it. If yes, then you can move to the next step. And if not, then the product is not considered deemed to comply with the building code, and a BCA will need to conduct a normal reasonable grounds assessment. So from where we were just before on our current recognition notices page, let's take a look at how to find a certificate number on a notice. So say we are looking at a watermark certificate that has been certified to AS/NZS 3662. We need to find the appropriate notice for that one, which conveniently is the first one on our page here. So you need to click the link for that PDF, Say our certificate number is WM-022117. You can Control F on the document or scroll down depending on your preference. And there's the certificate number there with other relevant details, including the certification body that issued it and the expiry date for the certificate that was included as part of the notice. If something doesn't match up, then it is not deemed to comply. You may already be aware that there are a number of registers that show watermark certificates. And it's probably important to note at this time of the training that the watermark database on the Australian Building Code Board website is currently experiencing search function issues, but we believe this is in the process of being fixed. There are a number of other places you can search for watermark certificates, such as the BCA'S register, the accreditation body for watermark, or some of the certification bodies have their own registers of their watermark certificates themselves. So a BCA will need to check one of these registers to cross-check that the details of the certificate are actually correct. And following the same process, you guessed it, if yes, then you can move on to the next step in the checklist. And if not, then this product is not considered then to comply with the building code, and the BCA will conduct a normal assessment. The next step in this process is to ensure that the product specified is being used in accordance within the scope and to all conditions and limitations on the recognition notice. The recognition notice will specify the building code clauses MB has validated the product complies with and any conditions or limitations of use. The product may need to show compliance to additional code clauses that are not included on the recognition notice, as the recognition notice does not need to show all relevant building code clauses for that product. For any additional code clauses, the BCA will need to follow their normal reasonable grounds assessment. If we go back to our example from earlier, here is the recognition notice for that certificate. You can see at the top of the notice that the building code clauses that MB has validated as part of our recognition process. There are conditions and limitations for this certificate on this notice, which include a note that the certified intended uses of the products in the notice are laid out in the watermark schedule of products. That can be found on the ABCB website. Just as an FYI, this is a condition on all of our current watermark recognition notices. So the final thing to check is to ensure that the consent application includes all relevant documentation such as installation manuals. If no, similar vein, then this product is not considered deemed to comply and a BCA will need to conduct a normal assessment. So if you've gotten through all of that in your checklist with all ticks, then you are required under Section 19 of the Building Act to accept the recognition notice as establishing compliance with those code clauses. BCAs are protected from liability under the Act when acting in good faith on MB's recognition. So where do we go from there? The BCO checks that all of the other information provided in the building consent application and that they're satisfied on reasonable grounds, that the work, if completed in accordance with the plans and specifications provided, will comply with the performance requirements of the building code. The BCO grants the building consent, stamps the plans and specifications, generates the building consent and any other accompanying documentation, and notifies the agent and the owner that the building consent's been granted. On payment of the processing fees, the building consent is issued and building work can now begin. I will now pass to Claire Botha, Principal Advisor in our Building System Delivery and Assurance team, to chat us through Codemark and product assurance. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks, Sophie, and kia ora koutou. As many of you will know, Codemark is a voluntary product certification scheme in New Zealand and shows that a building product or building method meets the requirements of the New Zealand Building Code. Using Codemark certified product does not eliminate the need for a building consent or for the Building Consent Authority's inspections during that building process. A register of current CodeMark certificates can be found on our Te Pai portal through the Building Performance website. There is a fair amount of information on the scheme itself if you're interested in finding more out about CodeMark. This includes information on the CodeMark scheme, how it works, and when it comes to applying for a certificate, and further resources to support the scheme. As you can see, there is a lot of information here for various different audiences like potential certificate holders, certification bodies, and the general public. Our register of CodeMark certificates is called our Product Certificate Register on Te Pai and has useful information on how to search this register for what you need, which we will touch on shortly. Once you have got into our register, you can click to open the PDF version of the certificate to validate the information you need, and there is also metadata information on those register records too to assist with your searching. We would recommend favoriting the Te Pai register on your browser so that you can receive a CodeMark certificate alongside a building consent application. You can easily check what you need to do. So, what does a BCA need to check when it comes to a CodeMark certificate? Under Section 19 of the Building Act, a building consent authority must accept a current registered product certificate if every relevant condition in that product certificate is met, as establishing compliance with the building code. A BCO should check our Te Pai register of CodeMark certificates to determine whether the CodeMark certificate is valid, including checking that the version is correct, and whether the use of the product in the consent is within the scope of that certificate. If the certificate does not appear on the register, then it is not considered current or valid, and the BCA does not have to accept the CodeMark certificate as establishing compliance with the New Zealand Building Code. There are some tips on the register about how you can use our search functions, such as using an asterisk to broaden your search if you need to. Once the consent has been issued, the approved building work can commence. The Building Consent Authority will undertake relevant inspections as per the building consent and will need to ensure the CodeMark product is installed correctly. If the certificate specifies the product should be installed as per specific installation instructions, then the Building Consent Authority also checks that that is complete. So, what can BCAs do and not do when it comes to accepting a CodeMark certificate under Section 19 of the Building Act? And many of you will already know all of this. So, building consent authorities can check that the MB register to confirm the the certificate is current. They can ask whether the product or design is used within the scope and limitations of that certificate. They can ask for confirmation and/or evidence that all conditions listed on the certificate are met. And they can also ask for evidence of compliance if the use falls outside of the scope of the limitations of the certificate or the recognition. When a product is specified within the scope of its intended use and limitations outlined on that certificate, building consent authorities must not require any additional information or evidence of compliance with the New Zealand Building Code clauses that aren't listed on that certificate. They can't reassess or look behind the certificate to judge its adequacy, decline to accept the certificate based on their own interpretation of relevant clauses, suspend or delay a building consent application solely because they believe the certificate omits certain clauses, or treat the certificate as confirming compliance only with the listed clauses and attempt to assess compliance with others independently. If you are unsure and require clarification on the certificate, you should first contact the certificate holder or issuing product certification body for clarification, and their details are on the certificate and on the MB register. Please do escalate your concerns to MB if you suspect that the certificate is invalid, misused, or concerns remain unresolved. And you can contact us at codemark@mb.govt.nz. In the meantime, you should really proceed with the processing and accepting of that certificate. So where do minor variations and product substitutions fit into this process? The amendment regulations in 2024 codified 3 new principles into law, particularly A minor variation must not deviate significantly from those original plans, and product substitution is allowed if it achieves equivalent or better level of performance and it does not compromise compliance of other building work. A BCA has discretion to determine whether the change is minor or requires that formal amendment. If a product certification or recognition is withdrawn after it has been included in a building consent, the implications really depend on the timing and the nature of that withdrawal. Generally, if a product is certified and accepted at the time the building consent was issued, the building work can proceed as approved. However, if the product is later found to pose a safety or compliance risk, building consent authorities may require reassessment or remedial action. MB would also be keen to know if that is the case. MB's updated regulations also enable faster revocation of non-compliant products, so it's important to stay informed and consult with the BCA if certification status changes mid-project. We thought it might be best to briefly touch on and clarify the difference between CodeMark, the new approved product certified overseas pathways, and also other forms of product assurance statements like appraisals. CodeMark and the approved product certified overseas are deemed to comply pathways under Section 19 of the Building Act and have primary and secondary legislation that regulate these. An appraisal is a technical opinion, often provided by a third party, of a building product or method's fitness for purpose. The assessment that's done to evaluate a product and issue an appraisal or other forms of product assurance is not backed up by any other regulatory framework. There are no requirements in the Building Act that are placed on the organisation that issue appraisals or the content of the appraisals themselves, other than the fact that they cannot be false or misleading. It's up to the professional judgment of the BCA to determine whether they are satisfied that an appraisal certificate has enough evidence to show that the product can be used in proposed building work and that it meets the requirements of the New Zealand Building Code. CodeMark legislation requires that a CodeMark certificate covers all relevant clauses of the building code relevant to the intended use stated on that certificate. This is not the same for MB approved overseas certification, as MB can only evaluate the information that is available on the certificate. Appraisals, as mentioned before, are not regulated, and therefore there is no requirement that they cover all relevant code clauses. All three options provide technical information for a product, and only CodeMark certification bodies and certifying bodies that issue the overseas certificates are required by the legislation to be accredited, and in the case of CodeMark, also registered by MB. This means that they are required to have robust processes to ensure that they have the right expertise to evaluate the products and that there is ongoing monitoring of the product's compliance, right back to the manufacturer. This is not the case for appraisals. As you will be aware, not all appraisals are created equal. There are variations in the level of evaluation and assurance that appraisal companies undertake. MB also has a dedicated team who administers and monitors the CodeMark scheme and the recognition of overseas certification. In all three options can be used to support evidence of compliance of a product for building consent applications. All three are valid, including appraisals. It's just not all appraisals are created equal, and BCA should exercise professional judgment to determine whether or not they are satisfied that an appraisal certificate has sufficient evidence to show that a product can be used in the proposed building work and that it meets the requirements of the New Zealand Building Code. I'll now pass you back to Sophie, who will walk us through the multi-proof before we move on to questions.
Thanks, Claire. So now we'll just quickly touch on our National Multiple Use Approval Scheme, or multi-proof for short. So multi-proof is a statement by MB that a set of plans and specifications for a building complies with the building code. So multi-proof speeds up the consenting process, but it does not give the right to carry out building work that requires a building consent. So like CodeMark, you can find our multi-proof register on our Tapai portal through the Building Performance website. Similar to CodeMark as well, there's a fair amount of information on the scheme itself if you're interested in finding out more about multi-proof. We go into relevant detail on the eligibility criteria for multi-proof applicants, our application process, which has recently changed due to our new Tapai system, and information on how multi-proof interacts with building consents. The approval itself is publicly available on our Tapai register, but building control officials will need to view other supporting documents for multi-proof approvals, such as approved plans and specifications and approved structural plans. To do this, you will need to register for Tapai following the instructions on our website or on the register itself. Good place to start is by emailing multiproof@mb.govt.nz to register, and we will ensure that you're set up in the system. Once we have you set up, you will receive an email from the system inviting you to register to our portal. This email will come from a no reply Tapai email address and will include the link to the portal. We would recommend favoriting the Tapai register on your browser as well, so that if you receive a multi-proof approval alongside a building consent application, you can easily check what you need to. So if a BCA receives an application for a building consent that is accompanied by a multi-proof approval, then a BCA has a number of things that it needs to check. First, you need to ensure the application is within the terms of the multi-proof and the approval is current. You can do that on our register. You then need to assess the building code compliance of any building features that are not covered by the multi-proof. For example, site-specific features such as drainage, which could include checking that the certificates of design work for the site include specific restricted building work and all of the necessary information. You also need to ensure that the proposed site meets the conditions of the multi-proof, such as wind or climate zone limitations. You then need to ensure any other approval conditions are met, and you must then grant or refuse the building consent within the 10 working day statutory timeframe period. You will also need to advise the applicant in the building consent of the inspection requirements and any documentation that must be supplied before code compliance certificate gets issued, such as an energy work certificate or any records of building work from the trade licensed building practitioners involved in the construction of the restricted building work. A BCA does not need to establish that the building code compliance of the design the BCA does not need to establish the code compliance of the design that is covered in the multi-proof. You also do not need to undertake extensive comparisons between the approved plans and specifications provided by the applicant and those published independently on the MB register. It is important to note that when talking about multi-proof, that our minor customisation regulations came into force in September 2024. A minor customisation is a change to the building design of a multi-proof approval at the time a building consent is applied for. A minor customisation could be something like putting a window where a door was planned in the initial design, or mirroring the layout of a room to maximise sunlight or to work with a specific landscape. Building consent authorities will still assess changes to ensure the building will comply with the code, but people won't need to submit an amended plan to a building consent for minor, straightforward product or design changes. So that's multi-proof. And let's now move on to a summary of where we're going with our approved products certified overseas within the next 12 to 18 months. So what's coming up soon? In November, as touched on before, we will likely have a 2-week public consultation on the second phase of watermark recognitions for the approved product certified overseas pathway, with recognitions predicted to go live in December this year. Phase 3 is currently under development, and we will provide further guidance to the sector on the application process for applying for recognition. So you likely may not see any recognition notices outside of Watermark until later in 2026. We will also post a number of links into the chat for this webinar as we move through your questions, which include our relevant inboxes for the schemes we've chatted about today, if you need to get in contact with us about any questions. We also have some useful web pages and content that we will post, like our web page about how BCA'S work with the new overseas product pathways, the register of our current recognition notices, our TAPI register, and our certification scheme web pages. I will now pass back to Matt, who will lead us through question time. Thanks, Matt.
Sophie, thank you. So in summary, the Overseas Building Product Pathway is live. Focus at the moment on tapware. This will expand to more complex watermarked products in December, and then in mid-2026, there should be an application process set up for all other building product categories. So you should start seeing the first non-watermarked recognition notices appearing in late 2026. Also had a great summary of the other compliance pathways to compare. Now it's time to get into your questions. So I'll just ask Claire and Amanda to come on screen. Thank you. Right. Thank you for those of you who have taken the time to put questions through. Firstly, Amanda, I will come to you first. Can you just remind us why Watermark was initially selected?
Sure can. So Watermark, the Watermark certification scheme for plumbing and drainage products was selected first, primarily because Australia has a similar regulatory environment to New Zealand. Australia also mandates Watermark certification for specific plumbing and drainage products. Watermark products are also widely accepted here, so this allowed us to take a measured approach in implementing this new deemed to comply pathway and ensuring that the process for evaluating these products is robust.
Amanda, I'll stick with you in regards to phase 3. If there are a large number of applications in phase 3, mentioned windows, cladding, roofing, etc., how will MB plan to manage or prioritise those applications?
Yeah, really good question. So at the moment, we're currently developing the process for the recognition of overseas product certificates beyond Watermark, and that includes developing an application process for product suppliers and importers to apply directly to us for recognition. We need to ensure that we're able to recognise products that offer, the best benefit to New Zealand, and we'll also be looking at things in terms of priority, like products that are certified by schemes that have regulatory environments that we can compare and have similar sort of standards to us. We also need to look at prioritising products that have really good technical supporting information to ensure that we can evaluate those products well, and we have enough information to ensure that those products are suitable for the New Zealand environment. So we're still going through this process, but we are going to be publishing guidance on what types of products we'd accept for applications, the types of the level of information we would require, and also some information when we get through this process on what the timelines would look like and how we would potentially prioritise products. So more information is coming. Either by the end of, we'll probably have some high-level information by the end of this year, and then in 2026, when we have this process developed, we'll definitely be providing more information about how this will work.
Thanks, Amanda. Claire, you mentioned that CodeMark certificates cover all relevant code clauses. How are relevant provisions of the building code determined in a CodeMark certificate?
Yeah, thanks, Nat. So all relevant provisions of the building code are determined by the product certification body during that certification process. So they'll evaluate that, they'll look at the product and do an evaluation. They'll identify the intended use of that product or method, and then the applicable building code clauses based on those performance requirements and the intended use and scope and limitations of that certificate. They'll then require supporting evidence such as test reports and quality assurance plans for the manufacturing of that product. And to meet all relevant requirements to be issued a product certificate, a building product must comply with all relevant provisions of the building code for that intended use.
Right, Claire, I'm going to stick with you. Can you just remind us of the main differences between CodeMark and the overseas product recognition notices? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, so CodeMark is New Zealand's product certification scheme under the Act. So we consider it a gold standard for product assurance within New Zealand. It is specifically set up for the New Zealand environment. And as I mentioned before, that if a product has a CodeMark certificate, that it means that all relevant parts of the building code relevant to its intended use have been assessed and are compliant with the New Zealand Building Code. And it's considered deemed to comply pathway. The overseas product recognitions are a new option that were introduced this year that lets MB recognise products that have been certified to a tested overseas scheme as compliant with specific New Zealand Building Code clauses. And that really depends on the information that MB can validate. But once it's recognised, BCA'S must also accept them as a deemed to comply pathway, but they should look out for any building code clauses that have not been included within that recognition and also the conditions and limitations of that recognition.
Thanks, Claire. Amanda, let's get back to liability. Will MB be liable for failure of a product that relied on a recognition notice?
Yeah, another good question. So MB will not be liable for MB has liability protection under this approved product certified overseas pathway, but it is really important to consider the circumstances of a product failure. So liability settings remain exactly as they are now for any imported building product or method. So suppliers and importers need to ensure that products they are supplying do comply with the relevant provisions of the building code if installed in accordance with the technical data and specifications prescribed by the manufacturer. So in short, liability settings aren't changing. They're the same as they are now for any overseas product that is being used in New Zealand.
Thanks, Amanda. Sophie, what if a product overseas certificate is updated or the product changes? Who is responsible for monitoring?
Yeah, good question. So MB in short, but basically recognition notices is secondary legislation, so they don't have expiry dates. So MB will be required to have a monitoring framework in place to ensure that all recognised products continue to comply with the code clauses that we have listed on those notices. That could include regularly checking any product certificates that have changed or expired, or if a new product certificate has been added to a scheme we have evaluated. If a product certificate has changed, we'll need to assess that it still meets the criteria for recognition, and if required, those notices can actually be amended or revoked by MB. So our monitoring framework means that we'll need to proactively monitor and communicate when certificates are getting close to expiry, or for any expired or withdrawn certificates. We'd probably look at amending the relevant recognition notice and communicating these changes to BCA'S, as we do for kind of suspended and withdrawn CodeMark certificates. But that is kind of our framework. Our job is made obviously a lot easier by the people on the ground. So if you do see something in a recognition notice that you believe should be amended, then please do email our overseas products inbox. That should hopefully be in the chat already now, and we will action those as needed.
Thanks, Sophie. I'm going to stick with you. We've talked a lot about watermark certificates today. Does this new legislation mean that watermark certificates will now be required to have a recognition notice?
Really good question, and there has been some confusion on this on previous webinars, so I'm glad we're able to kind of explain it a little bit further here. So essentially, no. Recognition notices are just another pathway to show a product complies with the New Zealand Building Code. If a watermark certificate is supplied with a building consent application and it's not being specified to use this pathway or a recognition notice, then a BCA will do what they do now with that watermark certificate and perform their normal reasonable grounds assessment. It's also really important to note as part of this question that not all watermark certificates that have been certified to a particular standard are included in the notice for that standard. So as I kind of walked through before, we've got recognition notices per standard. That's not to say that every single watermark certificate that has that standard, that has been certified to that standard, will actually be in that notice. So it's important to check that that certificate number appears on the notice if it comes in front of you. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Sophie. Actually going to stick with you. We've got, and thanks for your questions here. From Brooke, where can we find the BCO checklist for processing that Amanda spoke about, please?
Sure, really good question. And I think it is possibly one of our poll questions towards the end of the Q&A session.
Yep.
We do really want to hear from you guys around whether having those checklists is an effective part of your process. So even expanding it out into a checklist for CodeMark and multi-proof. So yes, we do intend to publish something like that. We want to get your guys' feedback on whether you think that's valuable. So when you get the poll at the end of the session, please do answer that question so we know how many of you guys see value in that. Thanks, Matt.
Great, thank you. Vinoth has a question. Claire, what support does MB provide to builders, designers, or engineers to ensure compliance when using imported products?
Yeah, really good question. So I guess we would say that MB provides quite a few different forms of support for builders, designers, and engineers. Part of that is these pathways that we've just created. So the new overseas building products pathways through the endorsed standards, building product specifications, and of course the overseas product certification recognition. But alongside that, we provide there's also BPA, so the Building Product Information Requirements, which were introduced a wee while ago to support the compliance of building products generally provided for in New Zealand, but also imported products. They all have to have a BPA to show compliance with the New Zealand Building Code. And as well as that, we update compliance pathways and provide webinars and guidance and that kind of thing as well. Linked in the chat, there are emails, so our inboxes, so you can always contact us if you have any issues with compliance of imported products.
Thanks, Claire. Amanda, I've got a good question for you. How will MB monitor the success of this initiative?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is yes, we will be monitoring the success of the introduction of these new pathways. We're currently in the process of drafting an evaluation framework. So we'll be looking likely later on next year and into 2028 when more recognised products hit the market and they're going through the consent process. We'll be looking to get an evaluation project done on the success. So we'll be looking probably to do interviews or surveys with building consent authorities on recognition notices that you're seeing through when you're processing consent applications, and just looking to identify any pain points, how often these are used in consents. We'll also be talking to product suppliers around their intent to use this pathway rather than other methods like appraisals, CodeMark, or using alternative solution pathways. So in short, we will be looking to do a pretty robust evaluation framework from next year onwards, just to measure how this is actually working and if there's any tweaks we need to make.
Great, thanks, Amanda. Stephen, I hope that answers your question as well. If it doesn't, please put an additional question into the chat or the Q&A, sorry. Sophie, a question from Jill. Will watermark products be identified on the packaging or on the product itself?
Yeah, really good question. Thanks, Jill. And another one of those distinctions between kind of CodeMark and the approved product certified overseas pathway. So CodeMark has a brand and that is kind of stamped in product and packaging, and there are rules around using that brand if you are part of the CodeMark scheme. There isn't the same sort of requirement or even a brand for the approved product certified overseas pathway. So in short, product certificate that is included on a recognition notice will not have any sort of identification on that product or the packaging itself, but we do for Codemark. Hope that answers your question, Jill. Feel free to pop another one in if not.
Got a question just with regards to the register. I see that Claire's actually answered it, but I just wondered if we just want to touch on it publicly. Looks like there are zillions of these on the register to quickly look at for each consent. So do we just want to just clarify the number of recognition notices and products that are actually being represented at the moment and what that could look like in the near future? I'm just going to open that to the panel.
Sure, I'll give it a go, and then one of the ladies can jump in if I fail to answer it appropriately. So, yeah, you're right. Watermark has, I think it's something about 200,000 products possibly at the moment, with about 2,500 certificates. So, not quite zillions, but very close. So part of our process when recognising watermark certificates is figuring out how to do it in a way that can be easily used. So if we kind of go back to the examples that we showed, the recognition notices for watermark certificates particularly, which may not be the same when we come to other product types, all of those notices are done by standard. So on a watermark product certificate, you can see a standard in which that certificate has been certified against. So use that when trying to find the right recognition notice. The register that we have at the moment, we'll probably do iterations of it to make it more fit for purpose as we start to add more numbers and we start to see it being used. So really good point and something that we're quite aware of.
Sophie, I'm just going to stick with you on this. Jill had a question, again, Claire's answered, but just wondered if we wanted to just discuss it a bit more broadly. Does MB expect BCA'S are looking for a recognition notice for each tap in a building consent? Following on, then check this tap was installed during the inspection.
Yeah, good question. So kind of touches on a couple of parts to previous questions. So if a recognition notice has been supplied as part of the building consent application, then there will be requirements that a BCO is required to check in terms of does that product will be associated with a particular watermark certificate. So you need to check that that certificate is on the notice and go through that checklist. If a recognition notice hasn't been specified in that consent application, then you would just do what you normally do. So it really comes down to, one, has a notice been provided? And two, that product should have a link to a particular certificate or license number, and that's how you would find it on the notice.
Thanks, Sophie. Amanda, after the installation of a particular product, if MB revokes its certificate, what will happen to the property where it was used and who will take responsibility?
Yeah, good question. So as I think Sophie was discussed earlier with Codemark certificates, the process and the implications are exactly the same as for a recognition notice. So if a building product has been installed and it's gone through the consent process with a recognition notice and that consent's been issued, and if that recognition has been amended or revoked afterwards, then the consent has been issued, so it's fine. If there are if MB has major concerns about that product, which I'm hoping absolutely won't be the case, but if there are concerns, then MB will communicate with BCA'S, and it would be a similar process to dealing with amended or revoked Codemark certificates. I just want to mention, though, that as for Codemark certified products, this evaluation, MB isn't certifying these products, we're evaluating the certification of these products. So part of the evaluation that we do is really making sure that those certification schemes are really robust and they're certifying and evaluating and doing ongoing monitoring of the compliance of these products. So, this is a very robust process where we're talking about product certification. And you could see recognition, the recognition process that MB does is another layer to that. So we're not anticipating any issues there. But in short, we'd follow the same process as we would for any amended, suspended or revoked code mark certificates.
Thanks, Amanda. Sophie, Leanne has a question. Did you say we have to register for access to Te Pai?
Yeah, really good question. And sorry, Leanne, if it wasn't particularly clear. So the Te Pai register in the Te Pai portal is publicly accessible. So you do not need to have a login or anything like that to access it. So if you click on, hopefully the link is in the chat. Hopefully if you click on that Te Pai register, you'll see it's got a number of registers, which include the product certificate register. I believe the BCA register is on there, our multi-proof register. Where you do need to register for access is when it comes to multi-proof. So the approval or the certificate for multi-proof is publicly available on our Te Pai register. But when you have a consent that includes a multi-proof approval, there's a number of other approved documents that you need to view as a building consent processor, and that is where you will need to register for access. So if you go onto our Te Pai register for multi-proof, there is information there about how to register for that access. So you do, and she's going off memory here, you do need to have a Realme login, not a verified one, but you do need to have a Realme one, probably linked to your work email address, and just reach out to our multi-proof team via the inbox to get you access to that portal. If you haven't got it already, I'd recommend maybe just getting it and getting that set up so that when you do have one come across your desk, it's all ready to go.
Thanks, Sophie. Neil's got a great statement in here with regards to the presence of watermark branding. Neil, I'll just paraphrase what you've got here. And Sophie's response to branding is likely that with watermark, the product and its packaging will carry a watermark or watermark lead-free logo as it's mandatory in Australia. Other overseas products may also be recognised by MB, will be certified by a recognised international CAB under an internationally accredited scheme, in which case it may also carry a mark related to that scheme. So if you wanted to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, it was just a bit of a thanks probably to Neil, and completely right. So the recognition process for MB doesn't include a marking requirement, but the scheme itself, the overseas certification scheme, like our code mark scheme, may actually have their own marking requirements too. So it's not something that we're going to be looking at through our processing. But as Neil has alluded to, they likely might have one anyway to identify that it is part of that scheme. Thank you, Neil.
Clear. Question is not clear what incentive there is for a BCO to review the certificates register instead of just recording their reasons as an alternative solution by ignoring the declared compliance pathway from the designer. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure. Yeah, well, I guess I would say that the deemed to comply pathways are really intended to make the whole consenting process more smoother, right? And so there's no need for the BCA to undertake that alternative solution assessment because it is already deemed to comply with the New Zealand Building Code. The other thing is reliance on the those deemed to comply pathways. If it's been specified within the scope and limitations of the certificate and its intended use, then actually that indemnifies the Building Consent Authority if they're relying upon that deemed to comply pathway. Whereas if they step outside of that, they're essentially taking back that liability.
Great, thanks, Claire. Looks like we're coming to the end of your questions. There was one, where can we find a recording of this webinar? Do we want to give any further instructions on the location thing?
Yeah, sure. So what we might do is there will be a period of time where we need to make sure the transcription is accurate and get it published up on our website. But what we'll likely do is send that through in some form of kind of email notification whether that be through a newsletter of sorts. So once that is all published and up on the website, we will make sure to send that link around to everybody. And I do believe we can send it to everybody who's registered for this webinar too. They'll get a link to the recording.
Great. Thanks, Sophie. Looks like we've come to the end of questions. Nancy, can we just publish our final poll as we conclude today's session? I'd like to get your feedback on the content that we covered and also your level of comfort in dealing with this new pathway in the future. I'd like to thank you for your attendance today. We certainly appreciate your support of this new legislation and your great questions. As this process continues to be bedded in, the MB certainly welcome your constructive feedback. As you would have seen, we've got all the contact details and links to other resources in the chat. As mentioned, look out for communication regarding phase 2, which will include a consultation period scheduled for later on next month. Now, we will follow up with a webinar in late January that'll cover off what's been achieved with phase 2 and certainly give you further information and preparation for phase 3 coming online. Just while we're closing, Mike has got a final question for us. Thanks, Mike. Could the responsibility be placed on the importer to ensure the products are compliant, doing so in association with MB, and therefore anything purchased in New Zealand is deemed to comply? I'll just throw that to you, Amanda or Sophie or Claire.
Yeah, I can answer that. So the Building Act does specify, I think it's section 14G, that suppliers and importers are responsible for ensuring that their products do comply with the building code. So that already exists, and there is that responsibility there. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the liability settings for this overseas pathway, it is the same as it is now for any imported product. So suppliers and importers are responsible for ensuring that if their products are used as intended and installed according to the technical information supplied, they have to comply with it. They have to comply with the building code. So it is their responsibility to ensure that they do comply if they're importing products here.
Great. Thanks, Mike, for your question, and thanks, Amanda, Sophie, and Claire for your presentations today. Thanks for the team in the background, been helping us out with questions. Again, appreciate your attendance. Look out for a link for the link to the presentation when that's live. And I wish you all a very productive Wednesday. Thanks, and we'll see you again soon.